Well, a battle over who controls the Consumer Financial Protections Bureau. Well, it sounds like a Washington power struggle that doesn't really concern you. Well, think again. It's way more than that. Something that affects all of us, about an agency that protects all of us. Also, President Trump cracking some new jokes about CNN. The media will explain why it's no laughing matter. And then speaking of jokes or something, I guess, approaching them, the president makes his crack about Pocahontas to Navajos who were at the White House to get honored. Trust me, nobody other than maybe the commander-in-chief thought this was a knee slapper. Here's part of the cringe-inducing moment.
We have a representative in Congress who they say was here a long time ago. They call her Pocahontas.
Code breakers with an Andrew Jackson portrait right behind them when we do it. You cannot make this up if we tried, and trust me, I didn't. All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Hope you had a good Thanksgiving break. Let's get right into it.
The place is just, it's a wonderful example of how a bureaucracy will function if it has no accountability to anybody. It turns up being a joke, and that's what the CFPB really has been, in a sick, sad kind of way.
That's the White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, the man President Trump appointed to acting head of the CFPB. That's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the very place he just called a sick, sad joke. Well, here's Mulvaney this afternoon explaining what he's doing right off the bat.
So we put a 30-day hiring freeze here at CFPB. Probably more importantly, we put a 30-day immediate freeze on any new rules, regulation, and guidance. Anything that's in the pipeline stops. There'll be no payments out of the civil penalties fund for at least 30 days while I get a chance to see what's happening with that. I think there's in excess of $50 million in that fund.
All right, there's a lot to unpack here. There's the issue of what the law says, what this agency really does, and also really what the driving force behind all of this is. Now, this isn't the first time that Trump's appointed somebody who wants to blow up the very agency he or she has been appointed to run. Scott Pruitt, head of the EPA, it's an agency he sued multiple times with a mission he doesn't even believe in. Same goes for Betsy DeVoe over the Education Department. She's an opponent of just about everything to do with public education. And Energy Secretary Rick Perry, he said he wanted to do away with the entire agency before he was chosen to even run it. That's when somebody reminded him what the agency name was. But anyway, Mulvaney, he reported to work today, but so did a woman named Leandra English. I mention that because the departing director's pick to run the place is the woman on the side of your screen. English she's even filed a lawsuit attempting to block Mulvaney. So now nobody knows who's in charge or who's on first. But we do know that Mulvaney wants to tear the place down. Republicans like him, they've been trying to gut the agency ever since it was formed as a part of Dodd-Frank back in 2010 as a way to protect consumers. It's already helped about 30 million people to this point who were victims of abusive banking practices. It's collected a total of about $12 billion in refunds and canceled debts. Now, remember the Wells Fargo scandal we talked about on the show, where the bank intentionally opened up millions of accounts for unknown customers? Well, it was the CFPB that penalized the bank and doled out the $100 million fine. Still, I think a slap on the wrist, but that's beside the point. The agency was created to be dedicated to be the regulator to protect people from abusive practices. It forces banks to clarify the fine print and to clearly tell consumers how much their loans are actually going to cost them. Now, the Bureau also provides recourse for the consumers so they can get reimbursed if they're ripped off. It also curtails abusive debt collection practices, and it also cracks down on those aggressive collectors. You know the ones. So let's bring on our panel right now. Jeannie Zanos, professor of political science at Iona College and also a senior advisor at the consulting firm Applied Techonomics. I got the poll right, by the way. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author, freshly back from Newark. Lou Young, journalist, former reporter at WCBS TV in New York. He's covered the tri-state area for 36 years, not to make you feel old. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. Okay, listen, you can argue, Jeannie, that this agency that was created in the aftermath of the crisis in 2008, some have said, hey, listen, where's the check and balances here? They basically get to operate reporting to no one. Okay. But I haven't seen, since they've been appointed, the fears be actualized that there's this runaway agency trying to cramp down capitalism at every turn. I mean, I mentioned Wells Fargo. There's been others too, where even with them, these guys have got away with really bad practices. But now, once again, we got somebody coming in to shut the whole place down because they say, you know, it's out of control. What gives?
Well, it's like this overreaction, and you said it beautifully, and we've seen it time and time again, and it defines the Trump presidency. I think if there's one thing we can say about the Trump presidency, it's at every turn they have made an attempt to roll back any initiatives put in place by Barack Obama, and quite frankly, most Democrats who were before Barack Obama. And so this is a perfect example of this. You know, what you hope would happen is if this is, quote unquote, a runaway agency, there would be some evidence of that, and then the aspects of it that were, quote unquote, running away would be dealt with. But the positive aspects, I mean, let's remember why it was created. The positive aspects would be maintained and they would be forwarded. And so that's not what we're seeing here. It's like taking a hammer to what they're describing as a problem that they haven't even defined yet. And so it's that lack of evidence that really troubles me. They haven't produced it, and they've put in place somebody who's going to put the brakes on things that don't seem out of control.
You know, I spoke a little while ago. I was on the phone on the way over here with a banker, a local banker who I thought might agree that this was a bad idea, this was an overreach. But the guy is no Trump supporter, says, using Mulvaney, is Trump being Trump. But he says this agency, although it began with laudable goals, has become onerous. He says they're in the bank, you know, checking for dotted I's and crossed T's. They make mortgage applications very, very difficult. They make, in some respects, things harder for some consumers. He says they make it harder to do business. So he says there is something to be done with this agency. Mulvaney, he isn't sure is it, but there's something there.
And there have been criticisms, to Lou's point, in terms of Andrew, from small businesses, that it's too hard for them to get their hands on capital sometime. Now, we all remembered how over-levered the banks were, and, well, we all remember what happened in 08. I don't have to revisit it. But to me, Andrew, here's the point. I think Trump, on this one, he could play a winning hand with tax reform. If he wanted to play the populist card, which I think is what in part got him elected other than the other stuff, he could say, you know what, forget about deficits, everything else. I'm going to give as big a tax cut as I can to the middle class, and on stuff like this, I'm going to make the argument that I'm doing this because, while I'm looking out for you, the middle class guy, I'm going to make sure you can get capital easier. This is playing, we'll talk about the taxes, the next thing is, I'm looking out for the rich guy, I'm looking out for the corporations. Let's do everything possible to get Washington or anyone else out of their hair and let them do what they want. It hasn't been played right, let alone with the whole Pocahontas thing we'll get into today.
I mean, he certainly could do that, but consider how tethered his administration has been to the banking industry and to the investment industry. How many members of Goldman Sachs are in his cabinet?
Yes, you're right, but I'm shocked by that because he didn't need them to get elected. They didn't contribute to him in a big way. They gave to Hillary 5 times more than they gave to him. He didn't have anyone that was a quote-unquote insiders. You're right, he's populated his cabinet with it, but he wasn't beholden to him. I'm just surprised he's doing what he's doing.
I'm a little surprised by it as well, but he keeps referencing things like the stock market and look at how well the economy is doing. And while the Bureau does make life more difficult for financial institutions, you could also make the argument that it's holding back their stock prices, holding back their profits to a small degree. Now, there are lots of pluses that this agency does, but I think he's looking for whatever victories he can chalk up. Those victories are measured in terms of things like the stock market, and also, you know, he doesn't have a lot of legislative accomplishments, so this is another Obama-era thing that he can overturn and say, look, I've done that.
And just one thing, Dom, there is a thing called law, okay? And for me, how many times have we seen in less than the first year, whether it's with the travel bans that he can't put through, chapter and verse, he gets ahead of himself. Now we're going to find out maybe within the next hour who's the boss of the agency. But if it turns out, and it is Trump appointee who's going to be looking at this thing, that he's not going to get his way on this, once again it looks like the game can't shoot straight. You would think they'd have some clarity before they'd move on this thing.
Well, eventually and ultimately, Richard, the president will get his way in terms of the appointee to run the agency. He may not win short term right now, but ultimately it's his choice. I believe the courts will find for him to appoint his boss. But we're talking about the stock market. We're talking about everything. What about the little guy? What about the reason why this was put in place to protect people? What about that? Lou mentioned the banker that you spoke to that said, this organization has made the mortgage application harder. That's a good thing. What about all these Americans?
Unless you're applying for a mortgage.
That's right. But wait, what about all these Americans that got mortgages that the bankers knew they could not afford on day one? You were going under on day one. So it's a good thing that we have agencies like this. And the president, we can couch this in political terms, whatever you want. The president is looking out for his buddies and for his campaign donors. It's as simple as that. For rich people just like him. Period.
People for whom, when you get an excessive charge on your charge card, can say, put the supervisor on and get it taken off.
Right.
Poor people can't do that, especially if they don't have the money to make the payment.
And even middle-class people, which is where we're really going tonight with the taxes and everything else. And the only thing I'll say is, we don't have time for it, please check out the Wells Fargo story, okay? Vanity Fair did a phenomenal piece on this. The systemic plan to rip off millions of their own customers with these phony accounts, somebody should be looking out for it. That's my only point. All right, coming up next. The House, they've already passed a Republican tax plan, but it's got some obstacles when it comes to the Senate. In fact, we got a second hard no late this afternoon. We're going to take a look at the math in Washington and also the math when it comes to your paycheck if this thing passes, especially if you're watching us in New York and New Jersey.